Thank you very much. I'm Eric Langer. I'm professor in history in the School of Foreign Service, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator here for the last panel of the day. And the topic is Society Impacts on Civil Society and Participation. And we have some spectacular panelists here. First of all, Carlos Ayala Corao. Mr. Ayala Corao is professor of law across several universities, including the Central University of Venezuela, the Ibero-American University of Mexico, and Georgetown University. He specializes in public and humanitarian law. He has worked as a human rights specialist at several international organizations such as UNESCO, the United Nations, and others. He was also president of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights from 1997 to 98, and is member number 28 of the Venezuelan Political and Social Sciences Academy. He has been outspoken in the struggle against President Maduro's human rights violations. We also have on the panel David Smilde. David Smilde is the Charles and Leo Favreau Professor of Human Relations at Tulane University Department of Sociology. He is also the editor-in-chief of Qualitative Sociology Journal. He aims at developing a neo-Weberian framework for understanding the current political conflict in Venezuela and how 21st century socialism appeals to young people in Venezuela, why it makes sense to them, and how they think it is different from 20th century socialism. Between 2006 and 2007, he was also a visiting Fulbright scholar at the Universidad Central de Venezuela. Now, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask each panelist to talk for about 15 minutes, and after that, we'll open up to the public, because that, in fact, in many ways is often one of the richest parts, is getting feedback and comments from the public as well. So if Dr. Ayala Corao, if you could please start.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you, Father Matthew Carn, for the invitation. I feel myself at home in a Catholic Jesuit university, not only because I teach in Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, but because I am a graduate student from this university as well. Well, we have heard this morning about the total collapse of Venezuela in the economy side, in the society, and everywhere. And in fact, Venezuela has become what we can call a lawless country, with a total destruction of the society, the economy, and the institutions. This has been done in the name of the revolution, tearing all the walls of the rule of law, separation of powers, and democracy. When you see the figure that 1,500 enterprises, production companies, were expropriated without compensation with the support of the courts, you begin to understand why I'm affirming that Venezuela became a lawless country. And believe me that nobody from the public or private sector is going to invest again in Venezuela unless they have in place the assurances. And the assurances of security and predictability means rule of law. Not only laws, but courts. And that's why I would like to begin saying that the first public policy and national accord for the transition in Venezuela should be to reinstitutionalize the state, to put in place institutions, a system of courts, and to create a rule of law. I may say recreate, but I like the word create, because we certainly didn't have a full rule of law before. In Venezuela, you have to understand that there is a sense of exclusion unless you are a supporter of the PSUV, or now Somos Venezuela, and you have your motherland ID card, you are not considered loyal to the revolution, so you are not a citizen. Hence, you're not entitled to rights, access to government services, and benefits like the food bags. There is a lack of sense that you pertain to a society, to your future, and that you will be able to overcome the difficulties. All the social sectors, I must mention, union leaders, peasants, journalists, students, politicians who criticize or oppose the governments are subject to a generalized and systematic pattern of persecution, prosecution, jail, and torture. Why can all of this take place in a country? Well, the state and almost all these institutions have been taken away, hijacked, and not even by a party. When you mention a one-party rule, it's not even a party what is going on in this operation in Venezuela, but factions. Factions from the political arena, the military, the economy, and criminal groups. So the judiciary has been hijacked, beginning with the Supreme Court. It's been completely politicized. The prosecutors and Attorney General's office, the comptroller, the ombudsperson, the National Electoral Council, all of them were appointed in 2015 by a Chavista-controlled Congress at a time, but with a face and gross violation to the procedures and the supermajority required by the Constitution. And the National Electoral Council was, you will be surprised for this, was appointed by the Supreme Court, already completely politicized, through a political decision. So the appointment, which is posed in the legislature by the Constitution, was taken over by this Supreme Court. All of this has led to a lack of state institutions, as I had mentioned before. The justice system in Venezuela is completely politicized. It is not able to process common crimes and violations to the law. It's currently used as a tool for impunity in common crimes, above 90% percentage of impunity in daily common crimes, and 99% impunity rate in human rights violation. But at the same time, the justice system is used as a tool for the persecution and prosecution of all kinds of government dissidents. In the military, the administration and the judiciary and everywhere in the state, you have to obey not to the Constitution, not to the laws of the country, but to the orders of the few ones who control the institutions. So, as I said before, the government institutions are controlled by factions, sometimes by even we can call mafia groups, and if you don't unconditional support, you are then excluded and subject to reprisals, as Georgetown or other cases. And I must mention this, not even the government courts prevail if there are political orders in country, including those coming from the security police. We can mention the case of Goicoechea, who the security police kept him in jail, in their jail facilities for more than a year, even though he had a court release order in place that was not obeyed. This type of, I like to call it nowadays tyranny instead of dictatorship, has deepened and worsened since the unconstitutional and undemocratic Constituent Assembly was imposed. It was imposed against the Constitution in a single-party corporative structure established by decree without any consultation to the people. So it was imposed as a way to overcome the results of the 2015 elections where the opposition won the supermajority in the National Assembly. So this Constituent Assembly has hijacked the powers granted by the Constitution in the rest of the branches of government, especially in the National Assembly, Congress. And this body is issuing laws, has removed already the Attorney General when she became not loyal to the government. It has also authorized the trial of some representatives in the National Assembly. It has appointed the new and obedient ombudsperson and attorney general, approved the budget, and has recently called for illegitimate elections to take place. It is very important to understand that in Latin America and in Europe, you may have a Constituent Assembly, well, first of all, elected democratically, which only task is to write a new constitution. And it will cease to exist in the 6 months after the Constitution is proposed for a referendum or other kind of popular approval. This Constituent Assembly has declared itself above the Constitution. The Constitution is what this National Constituent Assembly decides is, and it's doing all of these operations without having written a single word of the new Constitution. So when you explain to European scholars that a Constituent Assembly is taking place in Venezuela, you have to begin explaining that they're not interested in passing a new constitution and put it for the referendum, but they are already taking over all the powers that the Constitution grants to the different branches of government. So the first step for a transition towards democracy, reconciliation, and peace in Venezuela has to be to cease the existence of this body, unconstitutional and anti-democratic body. Apart from that, I would like to have a few words on the prospect, the question that we were asked for social peace and reconciliation. It will depend on the process of truth and justice, as I was saying before, in the reinstitutionalization of the states, the institutions, and the democratic system. Of course, we will have to have a transitional justice in place, but it will require that victims of human rights violations will seek to find justice and reparation, both nationally and internationally. And I must mention that because of the incapability of the justice system in Venezuela to process gross human rights violations, to process persons responsible for narco traffic and other major crimes, there is a outsourcing of the judiciary taking place already. So when you see that the fight against corruption is going on in Europe, in Spain, even in the States, that's because the Venezuelan system is incapable of processing those cases. When you see that the International Criminal Court, the Office of the Prosecutor, just opened a preliminary procedure of investigation, it's because it's impossible that victims of human rights have their justice and redress and reparations in Venezuela. So what we're saying is that this description of a lawless country that is taking place has given place to foreign and international courts to take place the duties of the Venezuelan institution. So in the future, while you restructure and you get a new judicial system capable of processing all of these cases, beginning with the common crimes that go impugned in a 90% or more, you will have to count with international courts and even foreign courts that are affirming their jurisdiction under national or international law. So the reinstitutionalization of the rule of law and democracy in Venezuela will begin with the building of new institutions that have been destroyed and demolished. The National Electoral Council, the Supreme Court and the Judiciary, the Office of the Prosecutor, the Ombudsperson, the Office of the Controller, the Civil Service Administration, and the Professional Diplomatic Service, among others, to build independent and professional institutions inclusive for a constitutional democracy and rule of law. Of course, in the transition process, truly free and fair elections will have to take place. That cannot take place now because there are no minimum guarantees in place. With the Electoral Council taken over by these factions and the Chavista and Madurista party, with armed forces that have become politicized, it is impossible to hold free and fair elections. I would have few more questions to say, but because of the time constraints, I would like to stress how important it is not only to count on political parties to begin with, but the importance of the role that has been already played by human rights groups that, by the way, have paid a big price in persecution, by the Catholic Church, and I am talking not only about the hierarchy, which has to play a major role, and they have to pay their price as well, but by the lay priests, by religious orders who have shown even the greatest solidarity with the poor and excluded, and they have denounced abuses and violations of human rights. And all religious orders, including the Jews, the different Protestants, and others who have already suffered these persecutions. Union leaders that have played a major role, and when they began not supporting the revolution, they have paid the price. Journalists who have been persecuted and prosecuted, social media like RCTV and various radio broadcastings and newspapers that have been closed. And interesting enough, in other cases, they have been bought by government friends, and then they have changed their editorial lines. And last but not least, I should mention the role of student leaders, students that have been protesting in the streets of Venezuela and that have been detained and tortured and subject to criminal trials. If you think that the country is now somehow dormant or quiet because you don't see the demonstrations that you saw last week, you were wrong. More demonstrations are taking place as we speak right now than in last year's, but different from organized student groups. All the statistics will show you that in the poor areas, the excluded, the people in the slums are now protesting more than a year before. So this is a source of civil unrest that has to be taken into account and has to be part of the fight for democracy and the restoration of human rights, liberties, and rule of law. We are working in Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, trying to do some kind of networking with various groups who have been already working in blueprints, in transition needs in the economic, the social, and all kind of areas. And I've been working in the constitutional and legal area for the changes needed in a transition. I think the best we can do from the academia is to have the papers ready, so when transition begins, you don't have to begin to think what to do or who can do it, but something that has to be done regardless of who is in charge at that moment and is backed by a broader consensus from all part of the society. So I'll stop it here, and then we can comment with the questions, all the things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for being so precise in the timing. I really appreciate it. We have more time then for the rest. I'm sure there'll be very interesting comments. So David Smilde, if you could please.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to say thanks to Father Carnes and Regina Trigo for organizing this, as well as Angelo. This is a great opportunity here. I was happy to accept this invitation. I was even happier when I saw the questions that were sent my way, because I actually am a sociologist. In fact, I'm an ethnographer by trade, and this Venezuela crisis has sort of made me into a commentator on Venezuela. And I often talk about international relations and politics and party politics, but I'm actually a sociologist, and so I'm going to try to stick to these questions that were sent to me and do what I can. Because I think it's so important, and it's something that's often forgotten in attempts to understand the Venezuela crisis, that it's actually a very complex society. It's the social dynamics that underlie a lot of the politics that we oftentimes misunderstand. The first question I was asked was to talk about Venezuelan youth. How have they been impacted by the crisis? And this is I think probably the key question for understanding Venezuela right now. It's a question that I actually have quite a bit of experience with personally. My daughters, I raised my daughters in Venezuela. I've lived in Venezuela 14 of the past 25 years. I raised my daughters, they went to high school, just graduated a couple years ago. And whenever we go back to Venezuela, one of the activities that they engage in most are not pool parties or outings to the beach, but goodbye parties, because so many of the people they know, their friends, are leaving. And so it's just like, every weekend there's a goodbye party for somebody. And this is the way it is. It's, of course, this leaving and studying abroad has been a characteristic of the upper and upper middle class in Venezuela for a long time. But now it's just an absolute torrent, and it's not just the upper middle classes either. I was just looking at statistics from the last NCOVI poll that was carried out by the UCAB and the UCB and the Simón Bolívar University. And excuse me, it showed that only about a third of the people that are emigrating, of the young people that are emigrating, are actually from the upper social classes. So 2/3 are actually, it's a much more democratic emigration these days, at least in class terms. So I just want to point out some statistics to try and understand this. Now, some of these are the things that you've heard that provide the overall context of Venezuela. The NCOVI poll shows that poverty, using the scale that they developed, has increased from 48% in 2014 to 87% in 2017. In other words, in the span of 3 years, it has increased. It has almost doubled. And that's incredible. 80% have eaten less in the past year because they can't get enough food. 80% of the population. That explains what somebody mentioned about, in the past year, people have lost on average 11 kilos. And that's on average, because some people aren't losing anything. So some people have lost 20 kilos. The 60% of their polling respondents have gone to bed hungry at some point in the past year because they don't have enough food. That's 60%, majority of the population. 90% evaluate the situation of the country negatively. There are some things that you can see how this impacts young people in particular. When I say young people, I'm talking about 18 to 24-year-olds, not children. Specifically, young people that are just emerging into the life of a democracy. In this population, Maduro has his highest evaluation among people over 40. He has his lowest evaluation among people under 40. Unemployment rate in Venezuela right now is about 9% overall. But if you look at people from age 15 to 24, it's 19%. It's more than double. The statistics are dramatically higher for them. In just 1 year, in the past year, participation in higher education in Venezuela among 18 to 24-year-olds has dropped from 48% to 38%. Now, this is something that was actually an achievement of the Chavez government and later Maduro government in increasing the numbers that were involved in higher education, oftentimes through these missions such as the Misión Ribas and Misión Sucre. But those missions themselves have reduced their coverage just because of the financial crisis. And enrollment in private institutions, private universities has also declined. Fully a third of all economic, or just to give you an idea of what this looks like from the perspective of young people, fully a third of all economically active people in Venezuela right now work in the public sector. No, it used to be a number of years back, it's always been high, but it used to be about a fifth. Now it's a third. If you think of formal sector jobs, if you're a young person, that's what you want to think about. You want to think about a job that has some benefits, that has some guarantees. Half of all formal sector jobs are now in the government. So if you're a person that does not agree with the government and is not somehow connected to the government, that looks like a pretty bleak situation. You know, your prospects are very much reduced. You know, and it's important to think about what this means. This mass immigration, the statistics that I've been just mentioning actually were from August. You know, this was a poll that was conducted in August. My impression has been that this has dramatically increased in the past 6 months. This emigration from Venezuela. I think it's important to think about what this does to the Venezuelan democracy. No, it basically the people who man the protests, the people who most mobilize, the people who have most rejected the government and been in the streets clamoring for change have been young people. That was true in 2017. That was true in 2014. And so having and this process of emigration over-selects for people that do not agree with the government. And so this is actually a really significant escape valve for the government, the fact that this immigration is happening and it's a lot of young people. Let me just not be so pessimistic, and I was also asked to talk about participation. Let me just mention one thing that has happened in the past couple of years. Since 2014, there's actually been a dramatic proliferation of human rights NGOs. It's really hard to actually even keep track of all the different human rights NGOs that have developed, and many of them in the interior. Many of them are very small operations, one person, two persons. Oftentimes these are young people that were involved in protests or that were somehow involved in helping people that had been arrested, and they have formed their own NGOs. And there's a real proliferation of that. And also there's a lot of people that don't have many other opportunities. You know, at one point, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there were so many opportunities for people in the government that oftentimes they would lose many people, NGOs would lose many people. Now there's a lot of people that are going right into NGOs. Okay, another question, and all these questions are issues that you could write a book on. I'm just going to take a couple of little layers off the onion and we can talk about it further in the Q&A. The second question is, how has the Bolivarian Revolution altered reality and expectations of actors in Venezuelan society? Now, Venezuela is a large and diverse society with many different perspectives. I love to be able to say that the pain and suffering of Venezuelan society that has been through has been a learning process and is going to develop a new consensus. And I think you could have made that case 10 years ago. Maybe even 5 years ago. I remember in the election 2012, I thought, Enrique Capriles' attempts to reach out, the attempts to rescue some elements of Chavez's legacy, I think were quite significant. And there was a real sense in which the opposition had been sort of pulled to the left and had really been made to look at the plight of the poor masses. But I think things have changed quite dramatically. There's a couple things that are at play. I think on the one hand, the sort of obscene and cruel deterioration of governance under Nicolas Maduro has made Chavismo into sort of a caricature. And I think it's largely discredited any achievements that it might have had in the past. And I think it's in the process has also sort of discredited moderate opposition. I think that the destruction of Venezuelan society at the hands of Madurismo has I think strengthened the radical opposition, and I think that reduces likely any sort of likely process of consensus formation. There's much more dismissals of what Chavez did, attempts to try and say that what Maduro has been doing just emanated directly out of Chavez, all kinds of different things. are trotted out to suggest that there is no reconciliation possible. There's no dialogue possible. Today, the discourse is about that it's a narco state. You can't dialogue with a narco state. Last year, it was passports that were being sold to terrorists. Before that, it was missiles in the Paraguay Peninsula. All of these are things that are said that basically suggest there is no possibility of dialogue and reconciliation. I think the other element that, and this I should say is a little bit more speculative. This is something I see going on right now, but I should mention it. I think the sanctions. I'm a sociologist and I believe in social learning, and political sociologists believe in political learning. I think that the sanctions that are being considered, the oil sanctions that are in fact the financial sanctions, which I should say I actually supported. At least I did not speak out against them vigorously, and that was because I thought there were going to be surgical sanctions that would prevent the sale or the fire sale of Venezuelan debt. But these sanctions and oil sanctions, certainly in the future, are allowing Chavismo and the Chavista base not to recognize what's obvious, not to recognize the governance disaster that Nicolas Maduro's policies have put forward. And so that, if that proceeds, what I see is a hardening of the opposition, and I see a hardening of the core of Chavismo in the current political process. And so I think that makes me pessimistic about any sort of consensus building. I think there's more class division than ever right now in Venezuela, and I think the Maduro government still very much has a rhetoric and tries to prioritize the needs of the poor, but it has very little ability to do so these days. I think the opposition is perpetually in crisis. Some of which is induced by the government, some of which is their own making, but in the past year and a half or so has sort of largely given up on trying to reach out to its base or reach beyond its base in the urban middle classes. And I think as a result, the representation of Venezuela's popular classes, the representation of Venezuela's majorities is more distant than ever. I also want to ask on how have church, labor unions, and other important social groups reacted to the crisis. I'm just going to talk about the church here. The Catholic Church has been one of the strongest critics of the Chavez government virtually from the beginning, virtually from the month that Chavez was critiqued. And in fact, during Chavez's government, the Catholic Church ended up sort of reflecting the polarization of the country, because you had a hierarchy that was very much anti-Chavez, a population that voted that pretty much reflected political tendencies existing at that time, and a large amount of religious orders that participated in government participatory organizations, and many of them very openly supported the Chavez government. But one fact that's not often appreciated about the current situation in Venezuela is that the very same month that Hugo Chavez passed away, and Nicolas Maduro was anointed, was the month that Pope Francis was elected. And I think that has provoked something of a realignment in the church's role in Venezuela. It's still, have no doubt about it, it's still a leading critical instance, I think, in Venezuelan society. You just look at its declarations. But I think it's also become one of the leading promoters of dialogue, especially if you include the Vatican in this. I think we can add to this the presence of Padre Jose Virtuoso as rector of the Catholic University since 2011 or so, and which in Venezuelan society, being the rector of the UCAB makes you sort of one of the 10 most influential political voices in the country. And I think under his administration, UCAB has become one of the leading center of research and discussion and reconciliation in Venezuela. I think their work has been exemplary. If you could just look at, and I'm writing something about this right now. If you look at just their role in the past year, they were unrelenting. They were probably the only actor that had this profile. They were unrelenting critics of the government, of the move to the Constituent Assembly. They criticized it from the very first week, and they criticize the government for repressing protests. At the same time, they criticize protests, they criticize opposition for not controlling violence in protests, which in the end was the undoing of those protests. And they continually called for negotiation and dialogue. So I think if there's any place that there's going to be, if there's any actor that really has a vocation of promoting some sort of reconciliation, I think it's the Catholic Church right now in Venezuela. And finally, looking forward, what are the prospects of social peace and reconciliation? Let me just say that despite my having used those terms several times already, I think this is not quite the right question. I mean, I think this was certainly not the intention of this question. But notice that these are exactly the terms that the government uses. No, this is the terms that you can hear Nicolas Maduro on television probably today talk about. No, the government wants dialogue, peace, and reconciliation. The opposition wants protest, chaos, and violence. That's sort of the government's portrayal of the situation. I think that it's quite possible. I personally think, as a sociologist, I think it's quite possible that the government is actually going to achieve this. I think the government actually could gain hegemonic control over the institutions of the government. It could cause an exodus of all those who are not willing to submit or who simply are not viable and have to go elsewhere to actually survive. And they could end up with a population that's either clearly connected with the powers that be, or that are completely dependent and passive, or somehow are just socialized and learn to live with this new normal. I think that would be quite undesirable. So the idea, we need something more than just peace and reconciliation. I think of democracy as institutionalized conflict, no? And without that sort of debate, vigorous debate and conflict, I think it's quite difficult to have a thriving democracy, really even a thriving society or state. I think, if there were to be a transition, I think there would probably be a very highly conflicted period, much like what happened when the Sandinistas gave up power in the 1990s. And I think Chavismo would become one of the most articulated political forces in the country, just like Sandinismo was in Nicaragua. So I think that the question then is whether Venezuela can get back to that democratic sweet spot, in which inevitable conflicts between social groups can occur, but be channeled through institutions that at least have a relative consensus. The existing Venezuelan population, I think, polls are quite clear, the great majority is tolerant, they're democratic, they basically support, I shouldn't say basically, in the great majority, they support liberal values and they simply want to live better. So I think the problem is not so much that there's not a sort of public opinion consensus. I think there's a problem with, I think, political leadership and a fight over political institutionality that is sort of completely disconnected from the larger population. I think for many years it was the opposition that was consistently distanced from the Venezuela's majority. And I thought Chavismo oftentimes ran circles around it because it had significant connection. Now I think the government itself has very little exchange with the broader popular sectors and with a larger population. I think the opposition has improved somewhat, but still has a long ways to go. I think the opposition needs to develop a serious outreach program and start to build a base. I think Voluntad Popular has done, and Leopoldo Lopez did quite a bit of field work. And I think it didn't have quite the cross-class character that it needed to. I think Primera Justicia did quite a bit, and Carlos Ocariz in Sucre, I think, did quite a bit. But I think a lot of that has been sort of set aside, I think, because of the difficulty and the level of conflict. And the point here is not to sort of distribute blame, but to just point out there is still a really serious problem. I'm just going to end by just trotting out some statistics, just to give you a sense of how poorly we tend to understand the Venezuelan population. And these are statistics from the data analysis in December, so just 2 months ago. They show that 50% still evaluate Chavez positively. So somebody asked about, how can Maduro still have 20%? Well, Chavez still has 50% support, and that is amazing. 74% of the Venezuelan people negatively evaluate the ANC. no, the Constituent Assembly. I think that's good. But you go further down, 49% agreed with the governors who swore in before the ANC. When I heard that these governors, these recently elected governors had sworn in before the ANC, I was like ready to just stop democracy advocation. And I was just like, I'm gonna just like start ethnography of religion again. I'm not gonna do this anymore. I was so disappointed. I was depressed for days. But lo and behold, almost half were agreed with that. And similar percentages opposed Juan Pablo Guanipa's refusal to swear in. No, 57% favored dialogue in December. No, so I mean, what I want to point out here is that there's a structural issue for all of us in this room in trying to understand the larger population of Venezuela. Venezuelan citizens are not peer reviewers of the Journal of Democracy. They're not policymakers with master's degrees. They're just average people that think about politics once in a while, no, and simply want to live better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about half an hour, 25 minutes, so be happy to take some questions. And I think what we're going to do, as we have in previous panels, is take a few questions at a time and then hand it back to the panelists to do that. So I'd be happy to coordinate the questions. So yes, in the back there.
Hi, Carlos, David, thank you for joining us.
If you could identify yourself.
My name is Alejandra, work here at Georgetown University, and I'm from Venezuela. My question, we talked about economics and politics, and now kind of getting into the social aspect of the the current situation. Carlos, you mentioned how paramount it is to rebuild institutions, but how do you go about repairing the level of erosion that Venezuelan institutions have currently? Take into account the huge drain of young and skilled Venezuelans and the fact that 20 years into this regime, we have an entire generation that doesn't know anything different than what Chavismo and Madurismo is. And then thinking about violent crime, how do you go about, and obviously this is thinking once this regime is no longer in power, because I don't know that any of these solutions will happen in the short term, but how do you go about dealing with the rampant violent crime that you see in Venezuela, which is one of the hugest problems that Venezuelans are facing right now? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Right over there.
Hi, my name is Valeria Sanchez. I'm a freshman in the MSB, and I'm from Maracaibo, Venezuela. So I wanted to ask you, like, you talked about recreating the justice system and the law and what you mentioned, but like my generation, they don't really like trust the law at all. Like, I had a car crash recently in Venezuela, and I was more scared when the officer came than when I was when the officer wasn't there. So it's like this general distrust of the law and following the rules, because it's not only you don't trust police officers, it's like you don't want to follow the rules. When you see a stop sign in your car, that means, okay, I have to go because I don't want to be mugged. When you see the yellow sign, it's I have to run because it's going to go on red. And when you see the green, it's like, okay, let's just go. So it's like, it's not only recreating it, but it's also the culture within the society that you don't want to follow rules and you don't trust anybody that actually implements them. So how do you think we can affront the problem, or how do you see it kind of like becoming a little bit less pronounced?
Okay, let's stop right here for a minute and have the panelists answer. Excellent questions. So please, Carlos, you want to
Yes. Well, that's the kind of problems I'd like to have in front. Already to think on rebuilding institutions, the culture of the rule of law, security problems to be solved, so on and so forth, because there you have plenty of cases in Latin America where corrupt policies have been crashed and built again, where security policies have been put in place for, and in very few years they have begun to work on a steadily basis. I think that you have the possibility of restructuring the whole judiciary, beginning with the police and the prisons, go on with the prosecutors and the courts. How? Well, that's part of what we have been working in Universidad Católica. You have to have in place a minimum of international cooperation to do this, like it happened in El Salvador after the Civil War, like it happened in the early 90s in Colombia with the national police. You have to have international cooperation, and you have to count on the young people who have gone abroad like yourself, that maybe will have the ideals if opportunities and guarantees are in place to help your country back again. I think that you have to start with having a non-corrupt police that you're not afraid to approaching as you are right now in Venezuela. So you have to have a truly academy to form the new police persons, and not what you have right now, which is forming them in ideology and not in proper police techniques. You have to have a system of honoring and improving the good ones and punishing and getting rid of the bad cops. And for that you need at the same time independent prosecutors and courts. But when you see that 99 of the prosecutors can be freely appointed and freely dismissed because of whatever reason, and when you see that more than 88% of the judges in Venezuela are politically appointed and they can be freely dismissed, it's not rocket science, but you have seen how in Eastern Europe the judiciary has been built in very few years, like in, I would say, in the midterm of few years, you can begin seeing what a judge will begin to do if he is given the assurances that he won't be fired because he or she takes a decision against the will of the people who is in power, that he or she can take a decision against the government and keep her job and not being dismissed. We have good examples of transition in Latin America, but as we have said before, the Venezuelan case is unique in a sense, but it's not unique in the sense that you cannot take into consideration and enrich from experiences in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. So public policies have to be drawn, have to be clear, have to be in a manual, international cooperation as well, and the plans have to be implemented. They're not very sophisticated plans like to have an academy to train judges how to do investigations, how to conduct a trial, so on and so forth. You already have a big amount of young attorneys being graduated from the universities. Half of them, before 2 years, are abroad. They are going into exile. But somehow you can begin in a transition, building institutions and attracting your own people and foreign people and international cooperation. So my recommendation is to have the plans ready with international cooperation so that you can begin building institutions, which is not only law and structures, but it's also a cultural process which takes longer. But we have to begin at some moment because it all takes time.
I'm not going to repeat what Carlos said. I will just mention that, the Chavez government actually had a sort of a textbook police reform program from 2008 to about 2013 that I think in many ways was quite admirable and did the right thing. However, it had a couple of serious problems. One, there was never a decisive break with militarized policing. At the same time, virtually from the same month that police reform began, there were militarized I think at that time it was called the DBC, the Dispositivo Bicentenario, or something or other. No, there were all these militarized police things that were always in parallel with the police reform, and little by little, the whole reform was colonized by retired and active military officials. In fact, Maduro basically gave it completely over to them. On the other hand, it was not accompanied by judicial reform or penal reform, and that just made it really completely ineffective. You can train officers all day long, but in the end, if they realize that the people that they arrest are not going to be put away, they're not going to, they're not going to do their job. And so I think it was any future attempt at police reform, and I think there has to be decisive attempt to get away from militarized policing and reinstitute civilian police reform is got to be accompanied by judicial reform and penal reform. And I think these are very slow processes. Get away from the big expectations that this is going to lead into a decline in crime in 6 months or a year, and realize that this is a multi-year, longer-term process. I kind of see this kind of institutional building as almost like a collective action problem. No, it doesn't work if people don't trust it, and people aren't going to trust it unless it works. And so at a certain point, you have to do work and getting people to have faith in this and support it, and over time build up the institutions to the point that people consent to them. And we've seen this happen time and again. El Salvador, Nicaragua, Colombia all had dramatic improvements in policing.
I don't know if you want to answer the first questioners as well, if there was anything else that we had on the...
Was there something specifically for me? I thought it was about institutions as well. I don't know if I missed something.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
okay, good. So perhaps the next one, any other questions? That's okay, let's see. Let's start over here. Dr. Healy?
Hi, Professor Kevin Healy from CLAS, and I wanted to ask just about freedom of expression in Venezuela, particularly in the media, investigative reporting, the kind of broad representation of viewpoints in the media, but also in universities and think tanks, social research. How much is allowed in Venezuela? How strong is that institutionally? So if you just comment on that in terms of just overall freedom of expression.
Okay, great. And we have another question over there.
Hi, Greg Davis from Planet Risk. I have some Venezuelan friends, and I just wanted to ask a very practical question. Is there any way that, what organizations can we support that can give aid to Venezuelan families? I've had a Venezuelan friend ask me for money, so I'm just wondering how I could best support my Venezuelan friends and their families.
Great question. And let's take one third question over here.
Ken Coleman from the Association of American Universities. A number of commentators have mentioned the church and church-related universities as a venue for perhaps addressing the crisis through one means or another. My question is, are there explicit efforts, either in the Catholic Church or in Protestant groups, to put people from various social classes with various perspectives together for dialogue? Kind of the imagery that comes to mind is Israeli groups meeting with Palestinians. Of course, that does not solve the problem of the Middle East, as we've seen, but is anyone making those kind of efforts in religious organizations?
Great, thank you. David, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you for these questions. These are all right on the money. In terms of freedom of expression, this is a hard one to get your head around, because I think it's often misunderstood outside of Venezuela, but I think the situation is quite serious in ways that are also not quite understood. Venezuela is not actually North Korea or Cuba. There's not that level of control of freedom of expression. No, what the government has done basically has a huge state media apparatus. That basically goes everywhere across the country, especially in broadcast media. There are private media. There's things like Unión Radio, Globovisión, which show strong signs of self-censorship. But the self-censorship has a particular character to it. They basically will not cover live opposition events. They won't cover, like the protests in the streets, you would never know that happened from Venezuelan media. And so if you're dependent on Venezuelan media, well, it's kind of hard to find out. What they will do is they will have opposition leaders come on, on talk shows and make their opinions known and whatnot. So their opinions do get out, in broadcast media. On the other hand, there's a huge development in web portals, and news web portals, Efecto Cocuyo, Runrunes, El Estímulo. There's been a proliferation. There's been a proliferation everywhere, but especially in Venezuela. And these have some of the best reporters and best journalists in Venezuela that are doing work. And so that is available. Of course, we know of all the different biases, the different class biases that internet information has. Venezuela is the most Twitter sort of savvy society I've ever been in. Virtually everybody uses Twitter, and that's the way people find out about things. That is sort of people's main media mechanism, the ways to find out about protests or find out what's going on. So what you have now is I think the most serious situation is in broadcast media, and we know that broadcast media is what reaches most people. Basically in Venezuela, what you have now is you have from the center of the spectrum, like a partial center because it doesn't cover live news, to the far left or sort of pro-government. And there's no sort of really critical media. There's no, like what you would see on NTN 24, coming from Colombia. You just can't get that in Venezuela, at least for most people, unless you have web access. But among people that are active and whatnot, and really try to seek it, you can get information quite easily. But I think there is the beginnings of this hegemony across Venezuelan society. In terms of universities, it's quite interesting in the sense that, for example, the Catholic University has just flourished, has absolutely blossomed, and it's just the type of place you go to, and there's all kinds of debate and research and all kinds of things going on. I go back to the sociology department of the UCV, which just 10 years ago, when I was a Fulbrighter, I had an office there, and I sometimes couldn't walk down the hall because there were students debating. There were there were big things going on, and they had activities going on. It was just this hive of, I go there now, and there is nothing going on. Basically, professors will come in, give their classes, and leave. All of the offices are empty. Because most of the professors are basically adjunct professors. Nobody will leave their equipment there. And so I think the public universities, is where you're really seeing there's no research money, there's no money to go to international conferences. And so there's really been an absolute decline in
salaries are incredibly low.
Yeah, the salaries. I mean, I know so many people that are abroad, that have PhDs, are associate professors or full professors, and are teaching English in Spain because they can't make ends meet. I think in terms of the Catholic Church, yes, I think there's been, the Catholic Church has had this vocation, for some time in Venezuela. I think it could do more. Let me just be clear on it. But I think this is one place that you can see this. For example, in the past few years, the UCAB has had something called the Proyecto Juventud, the youth project that actually went around, first did a research project, then went around the country and presented its results, and then sort of gathered together youth leaders from across the country. And it was a very big effort to try and include people from all different classes. If you know about Catholic institutions in Venezuela, you know that Centro Gumilla is the Jesuit institution that has a long-term vocation towards sort of cross-class advocacy. And in fact, that's where Jose Virtuoso, the rector of the Catholic University, comes from. And if I'm not mistaken, on the nights when he doesn't sleep on campus, he goes back to La Pastora and sleeps there. And he still has a very integral connection there. So I think there is, I should say that is where you can really see this cross-class outreach. I think there needs to be more. I think there needs to be more everywhere. I think there needs to be more in the Catholic Church, but I think you can definitely see it there.
Yes. I do agree with which has been said about the church or churches in Venezuela. I think the church has played a key role, and I'm talking about the church, not only the hierarchy of the church, which has been a model for speaking out on behalf of their people, but also different religious orders. The Jews in Venezuela, the Protestant, they have an interchurches, let's say, facility organization through which they promote this kind of changes. But the church has paid a big price. The bishops and the cardinals have been stigmatized by the president, by Chavez, have been insulted, they have been restricted. Some of them have been persecuted as well. So the church is going on these efforts towards true and sincere dialogue, but at the same time, the church is very clear, asking the government to stop this call for the mockery of these so-called elections, which is a bad word for what it's going to happen. These are not elections. You may say these are not free and fair elections. No, these are not elections. This is something else, but these are not elections. So the church has been outspoken on this, and at the same time, especially the Catholic Church, through different religious orders, especially the Jesuits, have been in this trying to bring together people who is suffering, people who have been in opposite sides, and to bring about not the political dialogue with a dictatorship, but the dialogue among the people. So the church has been building bridges among the churches, among the people, and I think that, again, Venezuela is not what it was. The church in Chile is quite different, the situation, but I think in the future, it deems to be recognized the role of the church in Venezuela, and the role of the church, which has been brave in front of the government, but at the same time humble with its own people. Most of the solidarity programs to help feeding people in the slums of Venezuela, not only of Caracas, are run direct or indirectly through the church. Either Caritas or Fe y Alegría or any of these church organizations are the ones in the civil society giving relief. Well, regarding of freedom of expression, this is a big topic. I mean, you can just go and read the pages in the chapter of the new released report of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which was put out a week ago, and you will realize a summary of what the attacks on freedom of expression have been in Venezuela in the last years. You can't have dictatorship with freedom of expression. If you want to impose yourself over the people, if you want to silence dissidents, you have to restrict freedom of expression. And I'm not talking about broadcasting, big media, radio, TV. I mean, this is including that because not even CNN can be seen in Venezuela, CNN in Espanol, or other major broadcasting companies, because they dare to criticize the government. They don't want to have any dissident opinion being broadcast. And if there is a dissident opinion being broadcast, this will be somehow persecuted, and somehow it will pay the consequences. So freedom of expression, I take it as it is in the Universal Human Rights Declaration, is free from fear to suffer the consequences to express yourself. Sometimes you are able to express yourself in public, but if you have to suffer the consequences for doing that, this is not freedom of expression. But I would like to include in the current situation, not only the broadcasting companies which have suffered in Venezuela. As I mentioned at the beginning, various newspapers and radios have been bought. Have been bought for almost the same amount the Washington Post was bought here. Big amounts of money. I don't know the sources of those millionaires' transactions, but we don't know who the owner is. If you go to the mercantile register, you don't find who the owner is. What you find is that the editorial line has changed from a critical line towards against the government to a favorable editorial line in favor of the government. But if you go beyond that, you have to take into account that when the student stood up to go and protest, and he or she was detained, more than 12,000 arbitrary detentions have taken place in Venezuela. When he or she was tortured in the basements of the police, when he or she was killed, this is an attack to their freedom of expression. When the poor persons in the Caracas slums are going out, as we speak, to protest against all the evils that they're suffering because of the lack of food, lack of medicines, because the children is dying in the hospital, and they are attacked by the police forces. This is an attack on freedom of expression. If you want to help or convey help in Venezuela, there's several civil society and church organizations, but I just want to mention two that I know well. One is Caritas, which is a church organization, and the other one specializes in bringing medicines, all type of medicines into the country to give some relief, at least limited, but some relief, is Acción Solidaria. You find them in the webpage and ways and means to help them.
Well, I think this concludes this session. I want to thank the panelists very much for this, and thank you, the audience, also for excellent questions. We now have some concluding remarks, so please, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.
And I'll be very brief. I simply just want to say a couple words of thanks. First of all, thanks for participating in what we try to do here at Georgetown, which is, first of all, convene these kinds of conversations. But then it's been very heartening also to think about our task to form the next generation. And it's been heartening to see so many Venezuelans and so many folks interested in Venezuela here today thinking about how to pose what the future of that country will be. So it's really wonderful to be part of that. Thank you to our panelists for their wisdom, their experience that they've shared with us today. Thank you for our moderators that we've had. Thank you for all being here. I want to mention just a few people by name that helped make this possible. So our Latin American Board and Latin America Initiative that sponsored this, the Latin American Leadership Program led by Ricardo Ernst, his team of Cristina Sands and Paulo Vergara that helped with the work today. From the Center for Latin American Studies, Regina Trigo, who has been the main communicator with all of the different panelists, managed to get them here in cooperation with Carly Henry from the Office of Global Engagement that has made such a difference today. And then you've probably also seen some of our students around, both attendees and then helping run the event. They're students from the School of Foreign Service, from the Latin America Initiative, and from the various schools throughout the university. So it has been wonderful to be with you. Let me just make one little advertisement. If you're interested in even more things Venezuela today, you can walk down the hill, and at 1:15 there's a free concert being given by Jorge Glem. This is part of the Georgetown University Friday Music Series. We didn't know this was going to happen, but it's a perfect timing thing. Jorge Glem is a Venezuelan-born Grammy nominee. He's nominated for a Grammy this year, 2018. He plays the cuatro. So if you want a little bit of music, walk down the hill, ask a student where McNair auditorium is. It's not easy to find, but they'll lead you. Again, thank you all for being here, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.